Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Trish Yacarino. I'm with the Lectures Committee in PLATO. And today we have Dr. Elana Levine with us. She's a professor of Media, Cinema, and Digital Studies in the Department of English at UW-Milwaukee. She teaches and researches in the areas of television history, theory, and criticism, and also gender, sexuality, race, and class in the media, among other topics. She's the author of numerous books and articles, including her two most recent books, Wallowing in Sex, The New Sexual Culture of 1970s American Television, and her latest book, and on which this presentation will be mostly based, is Her Stories, Daytime Soap Opera and US Television History. In addition, Dr. Levine actually was as an alumni of UW-Madison. She got her master's and PhD here in the Communication Arts Department. So, Dr. Levine.
Thank you so much, Trish. And thanks everybody for being here today. I'm thrilled to be talking to this group as a Madison alum and a Milwaukee faculty member. It feels like you're all folks that I'm happy to be in connection with today. So as Trish was saying, my talk today really comes out of my most recent book, which was published in 2020. And I have some slides here that I can share. I might go back and forth a bit with the slides throughout the talk. My book, Her Stories, Daytime Soap Opera and US Television History, was really a way for me to bring together two main strands of my research interests in the history of American television and in women's media culture. So this was sort of the perfect coming together of those interests. Today, I'm going to share some insights from the book and my research in general that is focused primarily on the period from about the 1950s to the 1980s. Hopefully, we'll fit in that whole time era in brief spurts. And this is really a significant period of time, both for the histories of American television and soap opera as a part of it, and of women's roles and lives in American society. Of course, this is the time period post-World War II when women are encouraged to kind of take on conventional domestic roles. And then so many changes come as well during this period because of the rise of the women's liberation movement. Lots of other social change as well, but if we're talking most specifically about women's roles, that's certainly a major factor. So let me clarify a bit before I get into some of the nuts and bolts, just what I mean when I say daytime soap opera. Daytime soap operas are programs that began in radio in the 1930s and then transitioned to television in the 1950s. There's fewer of them on the air today than in the past. There's 4 still running soaps. One is running on a streaming platform. But those 4 are still airing daily, either in 30-minute or 1-hour time slots every weekday year-round. They tell continuing stories, mostly focused on interpersonal relationships, families, romances, that sort of thing. And they're sort of known for having very long, very convoluted plots. Sometimes the storylines kind of stretch credulity, and that they can be kind of outlandish, although that's was not always the case in the early days, at least. Viewers, even no matter how crazy the stories get, viewers tend to be most invested in the characters and in the emotional experiences that they have with those characters, more so than in the kind of twists and turns of the plots. Soap viewers tend to be willing to accept lots of unrealistic things happening because they get to watch the characters that they care about, experience those things, and go through that emotional kind of ride. I say this topic is important because this is a form of television that has always been part of the medium, and I'll give you a little bit of that history in a minute, but it's rarely taken seriously or looked at closely, in part because of its associations with women. Scholars before me have talked about soap opera as a space where women's needs and women's interests and concerns can get voiced. My research definitely explores that, and I'm really interested in those questions, but I'm trying to do so in a way that looks at how the programs and the audience's involvement with them changed over time, with changes in the world of television itself as a business and as a medium and as a technology, and in changes in American women's history in particular. So I'm really trying to trace that path throughout the book and in some of the things I'll talk about today, though I'm not going to talk about the full time span quite today. Now, I found so many interesting parts of this history that I can only kind of give you a few bits and pieces today. But I want to start with that post-war era and think about that point when soap operas were transitioning from radio to television. And we're trying to attract women audiences in particular to start watching them on TV instead of just listening on the radio. So in the radio era, soaps were more typically called radio serials due to their continuing narratives, their serialized narration. They got what was considered a quite derogatory label of soap opera because they were owned and sponsored by companies that made soap, domestic goods manufacturers, companies like Procter & Gamble or Colgate-Palmolive. Those companies would actually owned the programs and produced them in conjunction usually with an advertising agency. And they would use them as a space to advertise their products, their laundry soaps, their dish soaps, those kinds of things. The opera part of the name, soap opera, was meant to be a really disparaging contrast to the kind of mundane household drudgery that was associated with these kinds of products. And also to reference what was seen to be the very melodramatic stories of soap opera. These were really about the soap's reputation amongst pretty, kind of more elite elements of the society, kind of cultural elites. A lot of the disparagement of soap opera for decades was really rooted in these pretty dismissive characterizations of the form that started in the radio era. And most of the people making these characterizations didn't spend a whole lot of time with the programs either. By the late 1940s, it was clear that television was emerging as the major new medium. It was uncertain, though, whether daytime television really would work, whether it made sense as a commercial enterprise. Radio had been incredibly successful as a daytime programming medium, particularly in terms of reaching what at the time we would call housewives. Housewives were really seen as the ideal daytime radio audience because they could go about their housework while still listening to the programs. They wouldn't have to stop to focus their attention visually. The assumption at the time about television in those early years was that you would have to focus on it. You'd have to pay your full attention to it to understand what was going on. I mean, remember also the screens were super small in those days. And so you probably did have to watch a little more closely than we're used to today, but it was a new thing for people. And the assumption was that it would require people's full attention. Now, eventually, some of the folks who were involved in the world of radio serials wanted to try out television. And their challenge was really to figure out how to tell stories in this new medium in a way that would capitalize on both the visual and the oral qualities, because of course, suddenly there was that additional element. These folks knew that sound was still going to be really important because they knew that some of those audience members might walk away from the TV set to go, pick up the baby from their nap or stir a pot on the stove. And they also were really used to telling stories orally with sound, right? Because that was what they've been doing in radio. And so it was really a challenge to figure out how to do this for this new medium. One of the really interesting elements of this transition is that some of the folks who were most involved in developing this process were women. There were not a lot of women in the worlds of radio and television production in these days by any means, but soap opera was a place where there were women who were involved. And in part, I think that's because it was so acknowledged that this was a form that was trying to reach women. So it made sense that women would be part of their creation. One of the key women who was involved in this process was Erna Phillips. Erna Phillips pretty much invented the storytelling form of the soap opera in radio. She was initially an actress actually, but she became a writer and she created a number of different serials that were very popular on radio, some of which transitioned to TV. I'll talk about that in a second. Phillips wrote one of the first attempts at a television soap opera. It was called These Are My Children, and it aired for about a month in 1949. NBC, the network that aired it, was not wholly convinced of this need for daytime TV. I should make clear, the networks like NBC owned were radio networks too. And so they were doing really well in daytime radio. And so they were a little reluctant to invest too much in TV at the time. And 1949 was relatively early in the evolution of television. And so this was ended up being a kind of short-lived experiment, and it got canceled. Phillips was most effective, however, when she just convinced her employer, who was the corporation Procter and Gamble, to make a TV version of one of her radio serials that was very successful, and that was the show The Guiding Light. Some folks might remember The Guiding Light, either from those early days or more recently, it was canceled in the 2000s. Phillips was a really savvy business person as well as a creative writer, and she saw that television was the future, and she wanted her programs to be a part of it. And so she really had to convince Procter and Gamble, which is a kind of historically pretty conservative company in terms of being, risk averse. And she really convinced them that it could work and that women would tune in. And she got them to go along with it. But part of the deal was that she agreed to produce both radio and television versions of The Guiding Light. She did this for 4 years, and they weren't simulcast. It wasn't that just the sound from the TV show was aired on the radio. They were two separate, basically live productions each day. And with slightly different scripts, but mostly the same stories were happening. So Phillips was quite a pioneer in this way. She also pioneered one of the first 30-minute long soaps for television. I should make clear that the radio serials and the earliest serials on TV were 15 minutes a day in length. So the fact that 30-minute shows start to become a big deal is something that really was a step forward. So this is, a news coverage of the transition of Guiding Lights that I was just talking about a moment ago. Now, one of the shows that Phillips created that was one of the first 30-minute soaps was the show As the World Turns, which started in 1956. So I'm going to shift now and talk about a little more about the kind of way that soaps were grappling with women's roles and identities in this time. Phillips, again, I'm going to keep talking about her for a moment here because she created As the World Turns, which is the example I'm pointing to, and I'll give you more details about the story in a second. Phillips obviously was a career woman. She was single, never married, and she actually became the mother to 2 adopted children eventually. So she was a pretty unconventional woman in a lot of ways, and yet her work really validated and celebrated women's conventional family roles. Loving housewives were really at the center of her programs. Again, she was a savvy business person, and so this likely made sense to her given the presumed audience for her shows. But I think even, it's interesting to think about soaps in this way, that they had pretty conventional representations of women and yet also were a space for exploring the different potential paths that women might take. In part, this is because soap operas, like any narrative, are about conflict. And so the families, the marriages that were at the center of these soaps in the 1950s, they had a lot of problems. There wouldn't have been a story if there hadn't been conflict. So the characters face a lot of troubles. They're frequently unhappy. And so Phillips, she wanted to uphold those conventional values of marriage and family, but her stories often illustrated the many problems with such a lifestyle. And they kind of would almost always champion the interests of those women characters above the male characters. So let me give you an example of this. In 1956, she began the show As the World Turns with a story of marital infidelity. The character of Jim Lowell, who you see in the kind of embrace on the left side of your screen, he had an affair with Edith Hughes, who's the woman he's embracing there. There's some notable elements here of the way that Phillips crafted this story. She really made clear that no one character here was the villain. Jim was married to a woman named Claire, who is the woman in the foreground on the right-hand side, the image on the right-hand side. So Claire and Jim are both pretty unhappy in their marriage. Edith, the mistress, who was not married, she suffers quite a bit through this situation. And Phillips really wanted to tell a story where Jim and Claire would get a divorce because they were unhappy. And she thought this would be a great way to explore all this kind of emotional fallout for so many different characters. But Procter & Gamble, remember, a pretty conservative corporation, did not want to present divorce as a good solution to people's problems. They said, we don't want these characters to get divorced. If you are going to get them divorced, Jim definitely cannot marry Edith, his mistress, and he needs to be miserable if he gets divorced. So there were these, requirements that they put on her. And Phillips came up with a way to handle this. She did have the characters pursuing a divorce, Jim and Claire, and then she has Jim get killed in a kind of freak accident. She, this way, kind of didn't have to deal with making the characters miserable as a result of getting a divorce. And she could kind of shift the story and make it be a story more about the characters that she was most interested in, who were the women. Claire in particular becomes a really significant part of the story. She suffers quite a bit. She has a mental breakdown. She has all kinds of problems, but over time, she goes to therapy. She finds a new husband. She finds peace and happiness, and becomes kind of a long-running kind of matriarch character on the show. Phillips was a really interesting figure because she never really blamed the traditional gender roles. She was not really a feminist in the way that we might think of one. She wasn't critical of traditional gender roles, but she saw people, the characters she depicted as really struggling as a result of those roles and trying to really find themselves and find their true selves through that process. And this is really in keeping with a general emphasis in this era, particularly in the 50s, around therapy. Psychoanalysis was a big trend at the time. And Phillips herself was pretty preoccupied with her physical and mental health and was kind of a hypochondriac in some ways. And I think that she was able to tell these stories and explore these troubles of her women characters in ways that, sort of inadvertently perhaps, but pointed to some of the limitations of the lives they were living. Now, I'd like to shift and say a little bit about what happens on the soaps in the 1960s. In the 60s and into the 1970s, I'm going to turn off the, oops, sorry. Okay, sorry about that. I just wanted to go off of the share screen for a few minutes because I don't have any slides for this particular moment. The soaps began to shift away in the 60s from their focus on conventional marriage and family life. And they gradually began to take on more issues of the day. Across especially the later 60s and the 1970s, the soaps began to tell stories that explored all the sort of social changes that were happening in that era. It definitely changes around gender roles, but also to some extent, things like racial identity start to become a part of the soaps as they start to introduce some Black characters, for example. The assumption was still that the soaps were directed towards an audience of housewives. And the assumption was that those housewives were white and middle class, even though it's clear, there's lots of evidence that the audience was much broader than that. It was definitely more racially diverse and economically diverse. And it was also gender diverse. There were definitely men who watched as well. But of course, you have the growing prominence of the women's liberation movement, the civil rights movement, and all of those things start to kind of make their way into soap opera stories in this era. So what I thought I would do is give you a couple of examples from this period in the 60s and 70s of stories about abortion on soap operas. And they, I think, give you two good examples of the different ways this issue was handled in that era. So these stories aired about 7 years apart. And they're both about young white women characters, middle-class women characters. But they have some really interesting differences. And I think that the differences between them really help us see some of the ways that soaps really shifted their engagement with social issues during this time period, and how sort of different writers and different contexts for their productions really affected that. So my first example comes from the soap opera called Another World. Now, Another World, go back to sharing here. These are images of some of the characters I'm going to be talking about. Another World was a new soap opera that started on NBC in 1964, and Erna Phillips created it. She didn't stay with the soap for that long, but she's responsible for this era, this story that I'm going to talk about. And it was owned by Procter & Gamble, just like many soaps were, though not all. All of those things suggest that this would have been a pretty traditional show, and it was in some ways. But compared to the older shows, The Guiding Lights, The As the World Turns, Another World was a little bit more cutting edge. So the story that I want to talk about abortion had to do with this character, Pat Matthews. So Pat is the young woman here in these images. And in May 1964, so very near the beginning of the show, she has this boyfriend, Tom, who's the young man here, and she's in love with him, and they have sex. We don't see this sex scene on screen, but it's made clear in the story that this is what happens. And they're college students at the time. And she gets pregnant, and she hides that from her family. And she eventually decides to get an abortion, which was, of course, an illegal abortion in 1964. Abortion was not yet legal nationwide, obviously. She got ill. She has an infection. She gets ill. She learns that she's become sterile and is going to be unable to have children because of this infection. She ends up kind of getting into this state, and she shoots and kills Tom, her former boyfriend, because he's made clear their relationship is over. She blocks it all out, doesn't even know this happened to her. And it's not until February 1965, so a good 8-9 months later, that she finally remembers what's happened to her, and her family learns the truth. So in many ways, this was a real cautionary tale, right? It was about the horrors that a young woman who has sex outside of marriage might encounter. And that is pretty typical of stories like this that would have been aired before this point on soap operas, in some ways, probably without the abortion part of the story. And in general, sort of mainstream culture in the late 50s, early 60s, there were a lot of Hollywood movies that talked about these kinds of dangers. So even though the story was quite conservative in these ways, soaps are made up of talk, right? Most of what the characters do is have conversations. And so in all of the many, many conversations over those many months of story that characters had about Pat and her situation, there was a real exploration of what was Pat's position here? What was Tom's position? Why were they in this situation? What was difficult about this situation for them? And part of what I argue here is that I think people really could have read this story, understood this story in a range of different ways. Tom is really not a bad guy, even though he refuses to marry her, and he eventually breaks up with her. We know the character of Tom. His parents are divorced, and he's been very miserable and unhappy because of that. So he's sort of reluctant to just get married because of the pregnancy. He cares for Pat. He takes care of her when she gets the abortion and all of that. He's very honest with her. So he's not really a villain. And there's some interesting evidence of the network's censors and what role they played in the story. And they kind of wanted to make very clear that Pat wasn't just a victim. She deliberately made the choice she did, all the choices that she did. They tried to make clear where her infection came from, and in terms of kind of medical facts and things like that. These were surely steps to protect the network, right, and to make them not too vulnerable to criticism. But they all contributed to there being some ambiguity around Pat's story. Did she make bad choices, or was her situation just an impossible one to navigate? What made it so untenable for her? What was the real problem in this situation? Okay, so keep Pat's story in mind. I want to tell you about another story that happens 7 years later. So the second story took place on All My Children, which was a new soap opera on ABC. It began in 1970. The story I'm talking about happened in 1971. And it featured the character Erica Kane, who was played by the actress Susan Lucci across decades. So you may know of her even if you didn't know All My Children. So Erica Kane Martin, she's married at the time, is a college student as well. She's a very kind of selfish, vain character. And she does not want to be a mother. She knows that she would make a terrible mother. She finds that she's pregnant, and she travels from her home in Pennsylvania, where the show is set, to New York City. In the world of the story, and in the real world at the time in 1971, there's differences in state laws when it comes to abortion. You know, not unlike our current day situation, actually. She can get a legal abortion in New York, but the wait for the procedure is too long, and she ends up coming back home and sort of manipulates her way into getting an abortion in Pennsylvania, which is, she gets a legal abortion in Pennsylvania, but there's a lot in the world of the story, and I believe in reality as well. There were a lot of constraints around what needed to happen to be able to get a legal abortion. And in the world of the story, one of those constraints is that her husband has to agree for a married woman. And the convolutions of Erica's efforts to get this abortion really offered a commentary on women's need for this procedure that was still quite restricted in terms of who had access to it. Erica is very determined, and she offers very kind of logical reasoning that makes her story very different from Pat's from 7 years earlier. Erica is very, unwavering in her pursuit of this abortion. She's certain that she does not want to be a mother, that she would be a bad mother, that she has the right to decide what she does with her own body. I should say these episodes are not generally available. It's unclear whether they exist at all anymore, but the scripts are. And so I know a lot of what I know about it from reading the scripts. Erica also falls ill from an infection after her abortion. It's kind of more about her own actions. She doesn't do the right things to take care of herself afterwards. But basically the other characters eventually find out what she's done, including her husband. No, but none of them knew she had lied to do it, to get the abortion. And kind of the story she tells is actually quite a lot like Pat's story. She lies and says that, she's unmarried and all of that kind of thing. And ironically, Erica's nothing like Pat. She's in total control of this situation and manipulates the whole thing, whereas Pat had almost no control and was sort of swept up in this situation that she couldn't do anything about. Both stories are quite different, I should say, from the way that primetime evening television was talking about abortion in this period. This was a time where in the 60s and in the early 70s, there were a few medical shows and legal shows that would have episodes dealing with abortion. But those were shows that had male characters at the center, lawyers, doctors, that sort of thing. And the narratives were really about them and their, kind of decisions that they made and their senses of morality and justice. In those kinds of shows, typically there would be, a woman who would be in that episode for the duration of the episode only. They would have an abortion. They would usually be treated sympathetically. But the stories really weren't theirs. The stories were the stories of those male authority figures. The soaps were so different because they put the women characters at the center of the story. You really knew what they were experiencing and what they were going through. And that alone made them so drastically different from anything else we were seeing on television or almost anywhere in the mainstream culture, at least at the time. So explaining these differences between the Pat story and the Erica story, yes, there's a 7-year difference. This is a time where US public opinion was really shifting when it came to abortion. There was starting to be a lot of public acceptance at that time period, across this time period. And it's hard for us to see today because of the way that abortion politics have changed. But, it didn't have the same kind of influence of the what's called the new right or neoconservative forces at the time. The stories really kind of bookend a period of changing attitudes around abortion. I think a couple of other factors are worthwhile to bring up here too. One is Agnes Nixon, who was the creator of All My Children. She was a protege of Erna Phillips, actually. Phillips sort of taught Nixon how to write for the soaps. Agnes is also the person on the cover of my book that I showed you at the beginning. Nixon had also been a writer on Another World. She knew about Pat's story. So my theory about kind of Erica sort of telling her story, lying about her story as if it's Pat's I strongly suspect that was deliberate. Nixon was younger. She was more politically progressive than Phillips. Interestingly, Nixon was Catholic. She had strong social justice leanings, including being pro-choice. Phillips was pretty conservative, even though she had this more unconventional life. And Nixon also owned her own production company that made All My Children at the time. She had to deal with network approval, but she didn't have the sponsor owner of like a Procter & Gamble looking over her shoulder. She didn't have that same kind of pressure on her. So she really had a different degree of creative control than Erna Phillips ever had. And I think that that's part of it. There's also things about ABC, which was a younger network. It had gotten a newer start. It was newer to daytime soaps. They were trying to distinguish themselves as appealing more to young people. So there's lots of reasons to explain some of the differences between those two stories about the society and the changing attitudes about the creative efforts and who was involved. But it's really, I think, a good illustration of the ways that soaps were engaging with those kinds of questions at that time. So I could say more about that era. It's probably my favorite era to talk about because there's so many interesting developments in that time. But I want to just bring us up into the 80s a little bit, because that was really kind of the peak of popularity of daytime soap opera, and just kind of give you a sense of how things start to shift around that time. So in the early 1980s, a number of soaps started to try out some new kinds of stories, largely in response to the popularity of one soap opera, General Hospital. So General Hospital had really built on trends that had begun in the 70s by focusing on a young couple. This is the couple Luke and Laura, who you might remember or have heard of at the time. Eventually, these young couples would be referred to as Supercouples. And what General Hospital did first, and then lots of soaps did, and copying their success, they started to shoot on location instead of shooting everything in a TV studio. They started to send their young couples on the run and some kind of adventure storyline. And all of this was really appealing to young audiences. A lot of the Luke and Laura's story aired in the summer when teenagers would have been home from school and could watch the soap every day. Definitely there were college students watching, whether in the summer or during the academic year. And that was a real shift, right? From that idea of having housewives be the audience. Sure, lots of those women were still watching, but suddenly teenagers, college students, young adults were watching as well. And it became much more of a kind of mass popular sensation in this era as a result. These super couple stories were fun to watch. They combined sort of the typical soap stories about romance and family relationships. And they brought in more comedy, they brought in action and adventure, they brought in mysteries, sometimes even science fiction. There was lots of pop music and lots of romance, increasingly more explicit kinds of sex scenes. I mean, it was still network television, but way more than there had been in earlier eras. And like I said, those kind of location shoots where it was exciting because it just looked different because they were out in the real world. Now, the popularity of these storylines, as I was saying, really made soaps mass popular sensations. In addition to the wider audience, the actors and the characters would be on the cover of mainstream magazines, those kinds of things. They were really something that many people knew about. It was not as much of a niche phenomenon as it had been. And as a result, the soaps made a ton of money in this period, particularly in this early 80s. The 70s did as well, and into the early 80s, early to mid 80s. So it's really kind of the peak of the popularity and profitability of soap opera. And I'm not going to talk today about kind of how things start to decline by the end of the 80s, but I can answer questions about that if folks have them. But it's interesting to think about this in terms of how powerful and widespread their popularity was at the time. Let me just say a few things about kind of what was going on with sort of representing gender in this context. So here's a kind of bunch of images of some of these different super couples from the era. So these super couples were really this kind of fantasy storytelling, right? They would have these young lovers who were doing all these exciting adventures. They really weren't very grounded in realism or social issues. And this was this fantasy era really walked this fine line between some of the progressive developments that had happened as a result of things like the women's movement, and the growing influence of more conservative kinds of forces that were kind of trying to reassert more conventional gender expectations. And so part of that fantasy, again, is that they don't really talk about social issues in the same way. There's not, for the most part, there's the occasional exceptions, but there's not those abortion stories, or, you know, in the 70s, there were stories about Vietnam War protesters, and there were, I didn't talk at all about race, but there were some really, a few examples of really interesting stories about racial relations as well in that era. By the 80s, that's all pretty much gone. At the same time, these were characters, and these stories were really clearly the products of a world that had been changed by feminism and the women's movement. They have conventional gender roles in lots of ways, but the supercouples were really kind of equal partners in their adventures. They would rely upon each other. They were always like dissatisfied with their conventional lives. They didn't want to stay home and, you know, raise a family and, you know, sit around and drink coffee, which had been the stereotype of earlier eras of soap operas. They would always choose adventure instead, and both of them would together. And the women would be very bold and self-assured and adventuresome, and the men were not conventional, you know, patriarchal providers like we'd had in earlier eras. At the same time, it was really a fantasy, in that all kinds of social inequalities, gender and other kinds, were sort of just ignored in this world. Oftentimes, the kind of formula of these couples was that they would come from different class backgrounds. Usually the woman was the more kind of privileged, and the man was from more kind of humble origins. But part of the story was that that didn't matter. Their love would surpass those differences. They would always, you know, that there weren't any real differences, any real inequalities there. As what sort of happened is that the soaps made it seem like these problems didn't exist. Of course, the supercouples, as you can see in these images, were almost exclusively white. They were all young. They were all heterosexual. They really offered a fantasy of a world where inequalities around gender or race or class were no longer problems. The implicit message, though, was that that was a world and a fantasy that was only available to certain kinds of people. So I make the point that the fantasy supercouple stories of this era really benefited from feminism and the women's movement in particular, by offering this kind of newly equitable heterosexual partnership. But we could also really see them as reinforcing conventional ideas about identity and refusing to acknowledge the many inequalities that continued to exist in the society as a whole. There's a lot of factors that feed into the end or the decline of soap operas after this point, but you know, I think there is something to be said for the ways that those stories, in turning away from the real world, really did eventually kind of, even though that was part of their popularity in that moment, that also eventually was part of their downfall, and that people could not connect with them as much when they didn't engage as much with the issues that real people were facing. So I know this was a zip through a lot of years. So I hope that this look at the history of the US daytime soap opera helps you to see some new dimensions maybe to this form of TV programming and its significance, and thinking about how our culture has imagined gender identities and women's roles in particular, especially during the decades that I've been talking about when these programs were most widely watched and most popular. I think we can learn a lot about the role of television in American culture and the way that we imagine our identities by examining the kinds of stories that get told. In this case, I'm looking at these popular television stories and thinking about who those stories are directed to. In this case, thinking about them as women's media forms. So thank you. I'd be happy to take some questions and just to hear more about your own memories and experiences as well. Thanks.
Okay, if you guys have questions, you can put them in the Q&A and I'll read them off. I thought of a couple. Where did you get the sources to do your research? Like you were talking about scripts and.
Yeah, so a really wide array of places. It's for a form that's kind of been disparaged in some ways culturally. There's a really rich archive out there. The Wisconsin Historical Society actually in Madison is a really valuable resource. Erna Phillips' papers are there. So there's a lot of documentation of her work, both like correspondence of her with various executives and things like that about the programs, but also a very large script collection from her shows, both radio and television. So that's really valuable. There's another set of soap opera writers, Bridget and Jerome Dobson, whose papers are also available in Madison. And they have, they come a little later. They started writing in the 70s and created the soap opera Santa Barbara in the 80s. So there's a lot of documentation of their career. And Bridget's parents were actually also soap opera writers, Frank and Doris Hersley. So some of their materials are in that collection as well. So there's these different places where there's manuscript materials and scripts. Somebody like Agnes Nixon, her scripts are all available at an archive in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, at the University of Pennsylvania. So there's a lot of paper. That said, the scripts are so voluminous, like they're every day, like I cannot read every script by any means. And I wanted to see actual programs when I could. There's some, increasingly because of YouTube, I'm not sure where folks get these, but there are kind of a smattering of episodes of some really old soap operas that are available on YouTube. And then from about the early 80s on, there's lots of soap opera content available because that's when fans started to have VCRs, and a lot of folks started to record off the air. And there's people who saved every episode. There's people who have saved, select storyline, episodes from select storylines that they were really interested in. Some of those folks upload things to YouTube. I sort of got connected to sort of some offline networks of soap opera fans who share DVDs usually of things that they've recorded off the air. So I saw some things that way. And there are some moving image archives that have some soap operas as well, mainly at UCLA and some at the Paley Center, which is it's a publicly accessible radio and television museum in New York. I would say those are the places that have the most moving image, actually have episodes that you can watch. But it's really kind of spotty. The early years of TV soaps they were all broadcast live. And so many of them just don't exist at all in any video form. And even in like the early 70s, when things started to be shot on videotape, videotape formats change over time and videotape disintegrates over time. And so there's a lot that was never preserved. I'll say one more thing. I could talk about this topic of, the archive and the materials all day, but one more thing I'll say is that a lot of the corporations didn't preserve the episodes, even if they did have them on film or tape, because they just weren't seen as being valuable. They were seen as being ephemeral, like you would air them once and then you were just done with it. Why would you need it? So no one knows for sure what Procter & Gamble has, if they have stuff in a corporate vault somewhere, but I'm pretty sure that they don't have. It's not like they have the full run of every episode of As the World Turns from the 50s or anything. I think that they just didn't save. And I've seen in the manuscript archives, memos about deleting videotape episodes when they reuse the tapes. So anyways, there's a lot of material out there, but some of it was a little bit of a journey and adventure trying to find.
We have a couple questions about the demise of soap operas. One, just soap operas in general, and someone asked specifically about As the World Turns. So you
Okay.
mentioned about the demise, and
Right.
more information.
Okay. Well, so I guess I'll try to give a brief overview. So the ratings for soap operas start to go down in the later 80s. They kind of peak in the early 80s, and then by the late 80s, they start going, and there's just sort of like a gradual and consistent fall in the size of the soap opera audience, basically from then on. A lot of people have talked about the O.J. Simpson trial in the mid-90s as being really detrimental to soaps because the trial aired on TV, on the broadcast networks, mid-afternoon for a lot of weeks. And I am a little doubtful that I don't think that was the big thing that, really harmed soap ratings compared to anything else. I think some shows it did more damage to, because even stuff like when the lunch break was for the trial. They would, depending on what hour of the day that was, that show would air and others wouldn't. I think it's a lot of factors that come together. Some of it is, people not being home and as much during the day as more and more women worked. But soaps have always been, once the technology was available to people, one of the most, the phrase that used to be used was time shifted forms of television, meaning that people would record it and watch it later, videotape it and watch it later. And that was never well tracked by the rating systems. Like, they never really knew exactly how many people were watching that way. So there's that factor. There's the factor of, this is also coincides with the expansion of cable and the fact that people had way more options. And then, of course, what happens in the 2000s is the internet, and our options for what we can be doing with our time and attention get even further multiplied. And so all of those factors combine, and just in general, broadcast television and its audiences and its profitability kind of decline at the same, at the same rate, at the same pace. So I guess I'm not sure that soap operas are that different from all these other things. So now we have 4 shows still in production. In the early 70s, there was the high point. I think there were about 20 daytime soap operas on air. So, I mean, they were not 20 for a long time, but there were a good 10 to 12 shows for quite a while. The real big, so there were shows that would come and go. Another World was canceled in the late 90s. And that was, I think, seen as the first really big blow, because it was the first really long running soap that ended. There were a couple that started in the 50s that ended in the 80s, but that seemed like a big deal to folks. And then things were sort of stable. And then in the 2000s, between about 2008 and 2012 is when things really shifted. And As the World Turns and Guiding Light were first canceled, basically Procter & Gamble, who continued to own those shows throughout their entire history, decided they didn't want to be in the soap opera business anymore, even though they kind of invented the soap opera business. And they weren't interested in continuing to make those shows, and they weren't bringing in enough revenue for CBS to want to try and figure out something else. And those two were the first kind of really long running shows that got canceled. And then in the early 2010s, ABC canceled 2 of its 3 remaining shows, All My Children and One Life to Live. And that was the other kind of big blow, which then that meant that by 2012, there were only the still running 4 left. It's been 10 years. Days of Our Lives is now not on NBC, but is on NBC's streaming platform, Peacock, only. But they, are still in production. So it seems like things are somewhat stable, but who knows? I make no predictions about the future.
This one's kind of related. Someone asked if there were any of the older soaps still in existence today.
So the soaps that are off, that are no longer airing. I didn't mention anything about Dark Shadows in my talk, which was, as people maybe remember, the kind of spooky horror gothic show that was on in the 60s. Dark Shadows is really the only daytime soap opera that's available in its entirety on DVD, or occasionally a streaming platform will carry it. And that was just the savvy thinking of the production company that owned it. And they, preserved the episodes, and he's since been able to sell them in various forms. So that's the only one that's available in its entirety. There's definitely a lot of things that are on YouTube. Sometimes they're there, and then sometimes they get taken down. There's a lot of talk about, it seems like unnatural for a streaming platform to carry some, form older, so either shorter lived canceled soaps. There was a show called Passions that was pretty outrageous that was on NBC in the 90s and the 2000s, that NBC owns, that, in theory they should would have, because it's more recent. It wouldn't have disappeared physically as some of the older stuff has. But it's pretty, I don't know that anything exists in its entirety, like that the physical, the tape of any other soap, at least of the older stuff, exists anywhere even to be shown. And it's a pretty, it seems to me that it's an untapped market. There's a lot of complications. There's stuff about like residuals that would have to be paid and things like that if these shows aired. But I hold out hope that maybe someday somebody will be able to figure out a way to make it work economically, and will let us see what there is.
Someone asked if you could comment on the movie Tootsie, which she said was a spoof on soap operas.
Yeah, I wrote a little bit about Tootsie in my book. So Tootsie, I think, is an example of what happens in the 80s and how widespread and mainstream soap operas became. It was not the only feature film that was sort of had a soap opera setting or kind of referenced soap operas at the time. It's, I think, the best known one and the most highly regarded. And going back and watching Tootsie to write about it, because I wanted to write a little bit about how these other cultural forms were depicting and talking about soap operas at that time when they had such widespread popularity. I was kind of surprised at how dismissive Tootsie was about soap opera, and how, well, I could go on and on about Tootsie. I think its gender politics are a little messed up too, in that like the Dustin Hoffman character who like impersonates a woman who's the sort of star of the soap opera. Everything happens from his efforts, and the kind of more feminized, women-centered world of the soap opera is seen as kind of less important as a place for resolving the various problems or finding a better way forward. It's funny. It's a fun movie, but it's interesting to see in retrospect. And I understand that, there's a Broadway show based on Tootsie now, but I understand that it's not set as a soap opera anymore. They changed the whole setting of it. So, which I get, given that soap opera doesn't have that cultural centrality that it did in the 80s, but it's also kind of a bummer. Okay. Thanks for asking.
And someone said that she loved the presentation today. She said she had 2 wonderful experiences with soap. She was married in the mid-60s and reunited with her college friends in the Chicago area when they had small children. And she said the characters on All My Children, which they watched, were like their mutual friends. And after especially crazy things would happen, they get on the phone and talk about their mutual friends on the soap opera. So, and then she said the later 70s, when her 2 children were came home from school at lunch, they were watching All My Children again, and yeah, she really enjoyed that soap, it sounds like.
Yeah, so, All My Children might be the show that people have the most fond memories of. I think there was such a kind of rich and like real familial feeling, I think, on that show, that people really felt like these characters were family to them, and I give Agnes Nixon a lot of credit for that.
And then someone said current soaps seem to focus more on glamour, beautiful clothes, and exotic locations and occupations with plenty of sex scenes. And she wondered how that developed.
Yeah, that's also, I think, a product of the 80s, the kind of mixed bag legacy that we get from the 80s. So, I mean, obviously, 80s culture in general starts to become much more of that kind of glitz and glam, Reagan era kind of stuff. And, before that time, the soaps, I mean, we tend to think of the 80s soaps as being all these like very glamorous people with like, very expensive clothing and things like that. That was not the case before the 80s. I mean, it was very much more rooted in realism before that. And so part of the adventure, excitement, going on the run stuff that happens with the Supercouples in the 80s kind of feeds into this more glamorous world. And then again, because of the popularity and success of daytime, you get primetime soaps starting in the 80s, like the Dallas Dynasty, those kinds of shows. And those were really invested in that kind of glamour, wealth setting. And so I think that something about that sort of seeped into the sort of sense of what soap operas are and what they're all about. And then it's kind of stuck with us to some extent through till today.
And someone else asked about the soap, the series Soap. I remember that. That was in the 70s too. She just wanted you to comment on that.
Yeah, so in the 70s, there was a primetime sitcom called Soap, which again, I think is a sign of that this was the era of great popularity of soap opera. It was a kind of a parody of soap opera, but I think a kind of loving parody. In my earlier book about 70s TV, I wrote about Soap. I didn't end up writing about it in her stories at all, but maybe I mentioned it briefly. But yeah, it was the thing about it is, even though it was a parody and over the top, it was also kind of borrowed a lot of the storytelling strategies of soaps and actually had very affecting, emotionally involving stories about its characters and their relationships to each other. And then I think I'd seen, I don't know if this was the same question or a different one, I saw the question pop up about the film was, oh no, I'm blanking on the title, with Sally Field and Kevin Kline in the 90s. That was also set at a soap. I'm blanking on the title now, but that's a fun one as well.
Oh, she mentioned the same person said Soap Dish.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
And then Diane, I saw that you raised your hand. I'm going to let you talk if you just want to ask your question. Are you there? Whoops. Maybe I did something wrong. Okay. She did write, Diane did write though. Her impression is some of the writers may have just run out of storyline in both Guiding Light and As the World Turns.
Yeah, I mean, I think that those show, there's different things that happen at different eras with lots of different shows in terms of like who were the writers, who was the producer, et cetera, and what kinds of stories were they trying to tell. And I mean, soaps change writers relatively, regularly after a certain number of years as a way to kind of revitalize and get some of that new storytelling energy in. And I know a lot of people were not that happy with those shows in the final years. But anyone who watches, I guess I would say, and sort of in their defense, anyone who watches soaps knows that because they go on for decades and decades, sometimes they're not so great. And then something, like they pick up again and the stories get more involving and the writing gets more compelling. And so I think you get those dips all the time. And I think it was like a confluence of a whole bunch of different forces of like a low creative point for those shows, plus the kind of economic factors that are really what makes the decisions in television. And all those things kind of came together and led to the end of those shows. Guiding Light had been around since the 30s on radio. So it was a really big loss for a lot of folks and for the world of soaps in general.
If anybody else has any questions, go ahead and put it in the Q&A. In the meantime, I want to remind people that next week, November 15th at 1 o'clock, the Diversity Committee is going to be showing a recording of Clint Smith's Go Big Read lecture that he'll be doing. I think he just did it at UW-Madison on slavery, and that will be followed by a discussion. So go ahead and register for that if you're interested. And also, I'm starting to work on the lecture schedule for the spring. So if anybody has any ideas of what you might like to see, you can email me. It's Trish Yaccarino, IACCARINO. I'm in the membership directory. Or if you forget, you can just write to the PLATO general email and they'll make sure that I get it. So, oh, here comes one. Do you include evening shows such as Dallas and Dynasty as soaps, and do they meet your criteria?
I mean, my book is about daytime, so it doesn't is not primarily about those programs. I mention them and when I talk about the 80s, because like I was saying a little while ago, they're really part of that moment when the soaps become this kind of mass popular sensation. And there are earlier moments where there's attempts to do soaps in prime time. I don't know if anyone remembers Peyton Place, but Peyton Place, which was of course a best-selling novel and became a feature film, was also a prime time serialized drama that aired, I think 3 times a week at one point, but in the evenings. Anyways, so there had been these attempts in the past, but it really doesn't become a big phenomenon until the 80s. I mean, I guess I would call them primetime soaps. To me, they're different. Because they're only 1 hour a week, the volume of content is way less than a daytime soap opera. And they tend to be way more invested in that kind of glamour, rich people world stuff than daytime is. And kind of just more over the top and excessive than often daytime is, which a lot of daytime soaps anyone who's watched them could tell you, are pretty boring. Like they're just people sitting around talking, and you couldn't get away with that in the same way in that primetime setting. So, I mean, I think one of the interesting things to notice about those kinds of programs, though, is that in some ways, this kind of serialized storytelling style has become all of television in some ways. Like with streaming in particular, the whole idea is that there'll be these stories that continue from episode to episode, so that you keep watching and you watch the next episode and you watch the next episode. And you know, there's lots of forces that feed into that, but soap opera did that first. I mean, there's no other form of storytelling, definitely in moving image storytelling, that, you know, pioneered that kind of narrative style than daytime soaps. So, you know, I think that there's a lot owed to that form in a lot of the programming that we watch today, even some of it that's very, you know, highly praised. And I think the Dallases and Dynasties are kind of part of that trajectory as well. They're just in a particular moment of it.
We just have time for a couple more questions. Someone asked, she said she hasn't watched soaps in years and years, but she wondered if the ones that are currently on include current politics in their storylines.
They do. It kind of comes and goes. Sometimes, you know, throughout soap history, the issues that they deal with are often issues that are more kind of personal, like things that people might struggle with personally. So there might be issues about, you know, alcoholism, or about, you know, some sort of, you know, mental health crisis or things like that, or, you know, physical health crisis, like particularly there's like stories about breast cancer and things like that because of being a women-centered form. So those kinds of things can be more sort of social issue political, or they can be told more as just like the story of an individual. But those can be moments where you get those. I guess I would say there's definitely been moments in the history of soap opera that have been more focused on social and political issues than the present moment, but it's also not totally removed. It's usually just dealt with pretty tentatively and briefly. Like, for example, there was a story on General Hospital where a white teenage boy got into a situation where he ended up having like a gun and was surrounded by police, and everything kind of was fine. But then there were two Black women characters, one of whom was like the chief of police, having a conversation about it afterwards and talking about how, you know, that wouldn't have been the outcome if Cameron, the teenage boy involved, had been Black, or that would have been a lot riskier situation if the kid involved had been Black. And it's like one scene, and there'll be these moments that just pop up where you can tell that they really want to explore something. But I think they're nervous, maybe because the political environment is so polarized these days that they kind of will touch on it and then they back off again. So there's more things like that happen these days. It's not like the 70s, or even like in the 90s, there was this era where there was some shows were very social issue engaged. And that is not really the moment I think we're in soap opera storytelling. There's just these kind of brief attempts and glimpses at it more recently.
I have one more question that came in that's related to that, but before I go on, someone was mentioning that they grew up listening to soaps on the radio with her mother, and then continued into the 60s on TV, and then even in retirement, she still watches The Bold and the Beautiful. It's a fun escape. And the imaginary friend someone mentioned, it's just because of the serial stories, you really feel like you get to know these people. So
for sure.
Anyway, the last question was, and this is related to the one that you just answered. Someone asked if current soaps have become more inclusive. Do they incorporate more racial and gender diversity than they did at one time?
Yes. So I think that is one, even though the stories aren't that explicitly political very often these days, I do think there's a notable difference across all the remaining soaps in terms of diversity, in terms of representation. I mean, there were eras where like the soap casts were almost or entirely white. And so there's a lot more racial diversity. And I think it's a little bit more substantive than times in the past where there was like no acknowledgement of racial difference at all. There'd be like a character of color, but nobody would ever mention that they were, you know, they were this race and the other people were that race. And so there'll be some, again, I mean, soaps are really good at kind of walking a fine line to try to keep everybody in the fold in terms of the audience and not drive anyone away. And so there'll be some acknowledgement of like, talking about, say, family traditions in a Black family, or highlighting certain kinds of foods that the family always has on a holiday or something like that. So there is some acknowledgement that there's, cultural experiences that are specific, or like the example I was giving about the two Black women characters talking about the threats that young Black men in particular might face. But so there's there's brief moments like that. In terms of sexuality, there's definitely, I think soaps were, sorry, knocked my computer there, were slower to deal with LGBT characters than some other kinds of difference. It really takes more into the 2000s before that happens. But I think all of the soaps, I'm not 100% sure about Bold and the Beautiful, have gay characters now. Some have trans characters, not a ton, but there's some. And I think some shows are more, do more with having that greater gender and sexual diversity than others. But you can see that there's a, desire to try to explore some of these things. And, I was talking earlier about women being an important part of the production sphere. There's a lot of gay men who are involved in soap opera writing and production as well. And so I think for a lot of years, and in the audience, of course, for a lot of years, that was, it was impossible to have any acknowledgement of overt kinds of gay characters or storylines. And I think that has started to change. But again, like is the pattern for a lot of soap history, pretty tentatively and slowly.
We've had several more questions come in, but I'm cognizant of your time. But one I just wanted to bring up, since you mentioned gay men, somebody wondered if women were still the primary writers of soap operas. So
I'm just like running in my head through. I mean, I think that there's a mix, not necessarily. I think there's a mix, I would say, of men and women. I don't know everybody's identity, that there's definitely some out gay men who are soap opera writers or producers. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty, I mean, I think like lots of places in the entertainment industry, I think they've tried to diversify in terms of like racial diversity, but there's a pretty limited number of like Black soap opera writers. But there are some, given that it's a pretty small world, there are some. So there's more diversity than there used to be, at least.
Okay. Again, I want to be respectful of your time. So thank you so much for being with us today. This was really, really interesting. So.
Oh, my pleasure. This was lots of fun. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
Bye.